Hello everyone, welcome to class. Today is the 27th and we're going to be doing what we were going to do Tuesday, but we're doing it today, which is HTML nesting. So, what does it mean? One of the things that I wanted to talk about today, something that I think I may have just been kind of skipping over a little bit from the previous classes, but and it's something that I know you guys have seen before. But we're just going to talk about nesting, and kind of the terminology that goes along with it, and so hopefully you guys have a better understanding about how HTML is nested and what it means, and then how this applies to CSS. So this is a pretty simple HTML snippet, and it's just a div with a paragraph tag and some text. And you have the parent. The div in this case is the parent, and the paragraph is the child. Not necessarily the text, but the tag, in case that wasn't apparent. But so I feel like when we do this, it's very simple. It's like, well, I completely understand. It's like a very simple example. There's one parent, one child. So what happens when we add another paragraph? So now you still have one parent and two children. So in this case, you have the div, and then you have the two children. And we can keep going. You can add three children. But you still have the same kind of parent-child setup. But what about adding another div? So if we were to have something that looked like this, now we're getting a little bit more complicated, but you can see how the very simple example that we started with, how you still have the parent div and the three paragraph children. But now we have another div, and in this case, it is a child of the parent div, and So now that I'll clear the slate a little bit, which obviously just happened, and now we're going to focus on this guy. So in this case, what is the span tag in this set of HTML? Because we have a parent, we have a div that is a child of its parent div, and now we have a span tag that is nested yet again. So let's go ahead and clear it up a little bit, because at this point the paragraphs don't really matter. So let's just focus on a very simplified example of this. So, what is this guy? Let's go ahead and label everything. So if you have these three elements on a page, and we'll go ahead and label the first one A, and B, and finally C. So A is a parent of both B and C. So the div that is the outermost containing div is a parent of B and C, the div and the span. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it there. So B is a parent of C and a child of A. Now I know this is starting to sound like those, Tommy ran Tuesday, but when did Lindsay run? Yeah. But really, I think what I want you to get from this is just kind of how everything continues to flow in a hierarchy. So C is a parent of nothing and is a child of A and B. So this becomes useful later on, but I'm going to go ahead and show a few more examples of nesting in HTML. So we have like a very simple unordered list that has list items. You have the parent, which is the main unordered list element, and you have a child, which is a list item, and a child, which is another list item. And let's take another example. You have a span tag that wraps an anchor tag, and you have the span, which is the parent, and you have the anchor tag, which is the child. And there isn't anything special about the formatting that makes it a parent or a child. These could all be on the same line, and it would still apply. But for like formatting, I decided that it would be best to do it this way. So that's like one of those things where that's pretty boring what we just did, and it's pretty repetitive. But I think the main thing that I want to get across is, how, start thinking about documents as like elements that have children, and those children have maybe other siblings, and then they can have their own children and children's children and so forth. So now we're going to talk about how to apply this to CSS. Okay. So last Thursday, we talked about CSS selectors. And mainly CSS selectors are it's a great way to go from having to type style equals and then all of your CSS properties and be able to target elements directly through a couple of different methods. One is IDs and one is classes. And so we start off with a regular old snippet of HTML, a classic div, and it has a class of container, which is actually used quite a bit in development. People usually give their, if you've ever seen a web page that has kind of a fixed width, then most of that is just done by wrapping everything in a div, giving it a class of container, and then styling the container to be a fixed width because it contains everything. So the class in this case is container. And is this ringing any bells for you guys? I assume it is. So we have the container. We learned about classes last Thursday. And what does it look like to target a class as CSS? So going back to our snippet, how would we change this to CSS? So watch carefully. Love that. Now I got myself distracted. So notice the period. Classes are always prefixed with a period. And I went over this on Thursday, but it bears reiterating. Notice the period. The period. I feel like this is the one thing that people always end up forgetting. It's just like basic syntactical stuff.
But you don't do it on body, right?
Well,
Do you always use a period for class?
yes, you always use a period for classes. But when you're styling elements, you don't have to use a period, but you have to target them by tag name. So that wouldn't be a class.
Like a div, you just write div.
Mm-hmm. Right. If you wanted to style like every single div on a page, you would just write div. Or every single anchor tag on a page, you would just write A.
So like the list of elements, we didn't make a period.
But
I'm not sure.
Well, from last class, if you say like list element, you don't have to do it because it knows that li is the list element.
Right.
So in that case, you wouldn't use a period.
Right. It depends on if you wanted to target specific list elements. Otherwise,
Yeah.
but we'll talk about this more. It's actually a great train of thought. You must have prepared for today's class.
I did.
Um,
Did you guys do?
Teacher said.
Just vote for something.
oh, sorry, it's my mom calling. Hey, Mom, I'm in class. No, it's okay. Maybe this will make you listen to the recording. I'm not kidding. But check out the class online, practicalprogramming.org. Check it out. Yeah, when I post it. No, I'm teaching right now. I'm not joking. I do have to go though. All right. Love you, Mom. Bye. That was just for you, Mom. All right.
Still.
Yeah, still not going to watch it. Okay, so I have a few more slides just talking about the period. Tiny period. Make sure you see it. Bigger period. Okay. All these things are like really great when I'm making the slides in isolation. Anyway, so let's look at a different example of how a class would let us target something in CSS. So now we have an H1 element, which is, a first level headline, and we have a class, and the class is head-line. So HTML classes and CSS classes, can have dashes and underscores. Convention is that you break them with hyphens or dashes. But they can't have spaces because spaces would be two different classes. So we have the class name, which is headline. So how would we style this class? So much like the other, we would just say period headline. So let's zoom in and give a tricky example. Okay, so say that we have this hypothetical piece of HTML, and what we want to do is remove the underline of the anchor tag in the H1. So all anchor tags, at least initially, have some sort of default style, and most browsers make them blue and underlined. So let's just say that in this case we would have kind of the anchor tag would inherit like the larger text size of the H1, but it would still be blue and underlined. So what we want to do is get rid of the underline. So without changing the HTML at all, how could we target that element to style it? So this is the element that we want to style. And we want to remove the underline from this particular link. Now, notice that there is also another link. So we can't just style all anchor tags because we want, for some reason, the one on the bottom to keep its underline. So now we're going more into CSS selectors, which we talked about on Thursday. But when I think about my teaching method, if there really is a method that I use, it's more so that we kind of get ahead of ourselves for a little while, and then we come back and we revisit, and then we just keep kind of getting ahead of ourselves without needing to go through every detail. And now what we did last Thursday was get ahead of ourselves, and now we're kind of circling back to further explain with some better examples. So when thinking about this example that we have right now, let's think about something that we already know how to do. So how would we style the div with the container class? So if you go back to this example, we have a div that has a class called container. And how would we style that? Well, we would do just like we did with all the other basic class methods. We would say period, container, and then open up a set of brackets. So now then let's think about how we could get more, well, so this slide points out that right now, the CSS that we just did, it is targeting okay, hopefully this stays. So the CSS that we just did, which was just dot container, it's targeting basically everything that's in this box. So depending on how the styles are, if you were to say, do something like color black, then all of the text, unless there was a specific default style for color, all of the text in that div would be black. If you were to change the font size, unless there was a default font size set, like for H1, then, for instance, if you set font size on the div, then all of the paragraph tags would increase their font size because they don't have a higher level default, if that makes sense. So right now what we have is we have this, everything in the box, and that's kind of what we're targeting. So how are we going to be able to narrow scope by selecting children? So all of the parent and child stuff that we went through before, hopefully now it's going to come into effect. So going back to what we have now, how can we target something more specific? So now we want to just go one more level in. So how can we make the computer go one more level? It's easier for us to say, well, just take the div with container and then let's just go like one more level. But how do we do that? So we're going to use a combination of CSS selectors, which is really just a combination of the two very basic ones that we talked about on Thursday. So using the class selector, we can say dot container, and that targets everything that was in the box. And now then, if we say, give me the children that are H1s, that's how we do it. So when you have a selector in CSS, whenever you have like one item space another item, it's kind of like reducing everything down. So keeping up with the slides, we have the H1, which is a child of the container, which is the parent. So what this is saying is, give me the H1s that are children of an element with the class called container. Does that make sense? Okay. So we have the element with the class called container, and we have an H1 that is the child of an element with the class called container. So we're getting very close to targeting our anchor tag. So how are we going to get to the anchor? Does anyone have an idea?
You just add an A after each one.
Yes. So that's great. I was hoping this would happen. Okay. So to target the A, we have basically, to write this statement in English, it is, I mean, oh my goodness, Mom. Mom, this is crazy. Oh, this is funny. Now both of my parents are calling me. All right. So this statement in English is target any anchor tag with an H1 as a parent, and that H1 should also have a parent that has the class container. So where are we now? So we're there. Boom. Now, this kind of generic exercise is something that you can piece together tons of different bits of this into your own projects. So, for instance, what we did this time is we had one major parent class, and then we had two descending elements, but you can mix and match. You could have had classes and IDs and tags, but they all kind of do the same thing. So you can go from like a broad class and say, give me elements that have a certain class, and then give me elements that have a certain class inside elements with a certain class. So it just kind of it allows you to continue to filter down the set of items that you want to style. So now we have one more that I'd like to do, and we're going to do it on your own. I'll give you like 2 minutes, which may be too long. So, given this or HTML, what we want to do is style the span tag in the last anchor element. So what kind of path would you take to get to that span tag and be able to style it? So I'll give you guys a couple minutes, maybe a minute, maybe 60 seconds. I'm looking at my timer.
Sorry, which one are we?
So you're trying to get to the very last span tag, which is in the last anchor. So what kind of path would you take to get there? And you guys don't have to answer, because I've got a couple of solutions. So just think to yourself.
Question. So, you know how in the last example we went like container, then H1, then A. Wouldn't it be exactly the same if you just took H1 and A and used container? You just said H1 A.
I was wondering that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you guys are going to...
For example, here we could just, like, there's only one span. We could just say find any span that has a parent.
Yeah. Man, you guys are killing me.
I have that right.
Yeah, this is good. That's good. You guys are kind of jumping to my next couple slides. You guys are moving at your own pace, which is very fast. So we'll get to that. But yes, you are right. So if you had to give me a path,
I would do dot container space. Oh wait, sorry. Dot yo space ul space li space a space span.
Nice. That is a correct path of traversal.
You skip some of those elements too, though, right?
Yeah, you can also skip. So we'll keep going because everybody's got this. You guys are too good for me today. Okay, so what'd you get? We already talked about some of this. One possible right answer is what Emily said, which was .yo, ul, li, a span, and that would definitely get you there, and you could target that element. One that I came up with, I kind of tried to spell something out, but I only really half-assed it, so
Span.
I don't know. Anyway,
Your lifespan.
yeah.
See what you're going with.
Yeah, I was trying to get like love, but there wasn't really any. Anyway, okay, so let's go down this path. So just to show you that a good way to think about these selectors are paths to items. So we start off with the beginning, which is the class yo, and that's with the div that I have circled. So if we continue traversing, we go ul, li, but you see that when we get to the li, we've actually matched two different elements because there are two li's that are actually in the same path. So if we were to just stop here, we could style, for instance, the bullets that are on the default styles of the li elements. And then once we go to the class VE, that actually gets us both of the anchor tags. So if we would have just stopped here, we would have been styling both of the anchor tags. So you can use something like this to your advantage when, for instance, you have a lot of elements that you want to look alike or that share some sort of functionality, so you give them both the same class. And then you can style both of them by class. And in this case, we could have done something different too. And finally, we get all the way to what we wanted to do. But because programmers are lazy, there's no need to specify everything, so long as the path gets you there uniquely. So another solution that you could have had was just traversing the classes to get to the span. So you could have had the class Yo and the class VE, and then the span. And in this path, you would have said, within the container or the class, or within elements of the class Yo, give me the elements that have the class VE, and then give me the elements that also have a span. And there's only one of those, so that's unique. And even shorter, we could have done the class VE span, and so we could have started at VE, which is unique among this document, and now we go ahead and give us the anchors, and then we can just go to the span class, and we're still there. But I tricked you. Maybe I did. See, I had foresight here because I make these in advance. But you could have also just done span, which you guys knew right off the bat. So if we had just done the span, then of course there was only one there. But most of the time, of any document, a document that has any kind of size, you're not going to be able to typically be able to just like style elements as custom.
So, I have a question.
Yes, question.
So, you may have just been doing this as an example, but is there a reason why you didn't put class VE in UL for this one? Like, I'm just wondering why it's different. Just for the example.
Is the question why I gave some elements classes and some not?
Well, because it looks like your LIs are pretty much the exact same, except for one has a span. So why wouldn't you just move that up to UL? Like, why would it say UL class equals VE, and then you wouldn't have to write class VE twice in your anchor tags?
Oh, right. Right, I understand. So, yeah. I mean, this snippet is mostly just contrived for the class, but there are some instances where, like for instance, in a more complex example, there would be an instance where you would have multiple unordered lists and multiple list elements that all contain anchor tags, and how would you be able to adequately target those? And so you may give the anchor tags a class. But you're right that in this case, we didn't even really need the classes. But it was just, they're there to make it a little bit harder for selecting by class.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like if we're faced with like a long list where a lot of the elements have the same classes or the same setups, how do we target a single one? We have to add like one class to one single A, for example, just to target one of them and then add it in CSS.
Right. You can actually, I'm actually not sure of the status of this, but you can actually say, so right now, all that we've learned as far as selecting is that you just get the children of whatever you want as you add additional selectors. with spaces, but you could actually do something like, container less than sign div, and it would give you only the divs that are first level in a container. And then you can also select, with more advanced selectors, you can select like the first child. So you could say, with just selectors and no classes, just say, give me the first LI.
So you
But-
would never have to create your own class. You could just use the HTML.
Yes, but that's not as well supported. And it's also it gets a little bit more difficult to understand as a developer when you're looking at it. You're like, oh, it's a little unintuitive in some ways, because if you have CSS that targets something as the first of something, and then you're like, oh, well, actually, I want to add like a header before it, and you just happen to reuse whatever they were targeting, and now everything is broken and you don't know why. But if you're using a class, then you would be able to target by class. So, and it's also not necessarily as well supported as the other stuff. I could be wrong on that. But anyway, that's a good question too. So yeah, in this case, if you wanted to do something like, okay, I want to give a special style to the very first list element, the way that I would recommend that you do this is just to give that list element a class, like of first. And the thing is, it can be a very generic class that doesn't even have any, it can be a generic class that doesn't even have any style associated with it, but then you would be able to style that first list element by saying, .yo ul li .first, which actually I haven't told you guys about this, and I just realized it, but if you don't put a space between a part of a selector, two parts of a selector, then it only selects items that have both of those things. So, for instance, I wish I had this written down. I should have put this in today's. For instance, you know how we did, we always started off with .yo, or we did one time. So we could have actually also done as one word div.yo, and that would give you the divs that have the class yo. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Could you also do .yo.v?
No, not in this case, because that would only give you elements that have both classes.
Well, I'm just saying okay, yes, I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying that also works, right? That's an example of using two.
Oh, yeah.
One.
Yeah, you could also use, if you had...
Because div was confusing because you didn't have a dot in front of it. I guess I was asking for the reason why two dots.
Yeah, if you have...
You would have two classes?
Yes.
Elements can have two classes. So whenever you give it a class, you would just say class equals class 1 space class 2.
Oh yeah, we talked about that.
So going back to trying to style the first list element, you could say, in this example, you could just give the class, you could give the list element a class of first, and we'll pretend like it's a little bit more difficult, and there was like an H1 tag that had a class of first as well. But you'd be able to do li.first, all one word, and that would give you the list element that had the class first. Does that make sense? Yeah, I wish I would have written those down.
Would you do a space between would you do div space dot yo?
No. So if you did div space.yo, it would say, give me the elements that have the class yo that are children of a div, in which case there aren't any. But as all one word, div.yo, that says give me the divs that also have a class called yo. So, right now we are at slide 127, which these always go a lot faster. And this is where I start finishing up.
That's a lot of slides.
Man, it's a lot of slides. I mean, it's like 3 hours worth of slides condensed into 30 minutes. I'm always amazed how this does this. So on Tuesday, we're going to be doing a little workshop, and I think what I want everyone to do is just kind of, it's going to be one of the last days that we focus solely on HTML and CSS, because I think at this point everyone has the basics, where right now the only thing that's stopping you from really doing it is just doing it. Once you get more comfortable, like just typing everything out and seeing how everything interacts, if you come upon a scenario where you're like, oh man, I'm just not really sure how to do this, then you kind of start learning scenario to scenario as opposed to learning the syntax. So anyway, the good news is that you guys know quite a bit, actually. Just need to apply it. So I'm not sure exactly how the workshop thing is going to work. If you have something that you're like, oh well, I want to try and do this, or maybe I'll have some like small sample stuff for you guys to work on. So come ready to type. And do we have any questions? And we have a small class today, so.
I do. Well, I'm looking at my stuff from last week,
Mhm.
and it looks like sometimes, I obviously didn't do it right because it's all my stuff, but, so if I'm putting, I guess my question is, like, if you have, let's say I have a class container and then I have a class header,
Mhm.
and I want to style the header class.
Mhm.
Do I just have to do .header, or do I have to do .container space .header because it's under the container?
You can do either. But
Does it change it depending on what I do?
No. It doesn't change it, but it just kind of depends. In these like very simple examples, then you could just do .header. But for instance, if you had if this was like a home page for a blog, and you had a bunch of article titles, and they were all H1s, and they had a class of header, then you wouldn't be able to say just .header if you wanted to do a specific one or something.
Because those H1s wouldn't be in the container.
Well, they probably would.
But that's
Really, I guess I'm just saying that you can target it however you like.
so long as the parent has a class, well, let's say like a child gets a specific class, but the parent already has another class that you want the child to have, you don't have to mention the parent class whenever you're doing the class thing. 'Cause the parent already has it, so the child, like if I have header is my child class,
Mm-hmm.
and container is my parent class,
Mhm.
because header is a child, or that H1 or whatever it is a child of the div that container is on.
Mhm.
It assumes that class.
Right. Some styles from parent classes will descend to the children, but not all of them. And it all kind of depends on whether or not they're applied. Like if you have something, because remember on Thursday we talked about how CSS part of because one of the questions was if you style something before you style something else, which one takes effect? Like if I style H1, just the element H1, and I say font size 25 pixels, and then I have an H1 that has a class called heading, and I style the class .heading, and I give it a font size of 100 pixels, what is going to take precedent? Because each of those target an H1. And in CSS, there's this notion of like the most specific selector. So in order, it is an ID is the most specific, a class is the second most specific, and then just the tag name is the least specific. But then, now that we talk about child elements, if I have two selectors, Like if I have dot container dot heading, that is more specific than just one class.
Yeah.
You know, 2 classes is more specific than 1 class.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So if I had a font size and header and a font size and container, it would take header.
Right.
Making more sense.
But to your question about targeting certain classes, in your example of having a div with a class of container and that having a child with a class of heading, you could just style dot heading and you would just style the child. You can omit the parent container class, but it all, like, you can omit it or you can add it, but it all kind of depends on the situation.
If you're going to use dot header as a child again later,
Mm-hmm.
then you'd want to include it.
Right. If you were going to use header as a class, because sometimes people people use class names that are semantic. So if you have something, you know, I'm just trying to think. Like if you have a class, you know, if you have a spot on your website that shows user information, you may give the div a class of user, and you wouldn't want to just style that as .user because you may use that elsewhere to denote user information or something like that. So, right, what Tyler said.
Can we talk a little bit more about semantic markup? I don't know if we covered it I didn't listen to Thursday's class last week. But I've noticed a pattern in the way that people use markup. Like, you know, you see wrapper and container, and those are commonalities, right? Those are common styling elements, or whatever they're called. What are the typical ones that people use? And what do they all refer to?
Yeah. So there's actually, as far as like HTML is concerned, I would say the most common elements that people use are divs, spans, headings, and lists.
Yeah.
And, you know, because of the way that the web came to be and, you know, the things that we used to use for semantic markup are really not, they don't really have that kind of meaning anymore because, you know, we're not marking up academic papers. So we don't, you know, yes, we use block quotes sometimes, but it's not as important as it was when the whole point of the internet was academic papers.
Sure.
But, so anyway, it kind of condensed into these pretty generic elements, and it's, and people give classes to things in some ways to make them semantic. With semantic just meaning that it has meaning.
It's easy to read, right? But again, what about, you know, seeing wrapper all the time, a container? I mean,
Yeah, what are
is there a good list of those? And like, again, what is the proper way to use them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if there is a really good list of like HTML classes that are used, but container is definitely a common one.
Yeah. Okay. I might dig it up. I'm kind of interested.
Yeah, that'd be good. Let me know what you find. There's also, for full disclosure, there's also HTML5, which is a newer HTML standard, and it has more elements that are designed to be like for, you know, the next generation web kind of. And you know, if you want to look those up and use those, then feel free. But in general, it doesn't change anything. It's just a different set of tags that might be more semantic if that's what you were looking for. Anything else? All right. And thus, the class is over.